we've made it. Apologies for the delay, and welcome everyone to this week's webinar, Applying Ethology. Today's speaker will be Anjuli Barber. And she, before we start, just a few notes on the webinar. Please take care that your microphone and camera are switched off. So we will have a smooth performance of the speaker. And if you have any questions regarding the talk, feel free to drop them in this Zoom chat function. And we will ask these questions at the end of the talk. So today we will have Anjuli Barber speaking about dog and how dogs perceive human emotions. Anjuli gained her PhD at the University of Veterinary Medicine in Vienna, and she's now running on a Marie Curie Individual Fellowship at the University of Lincoln, where she's currently the main investigator of two projects, Emometer, developing an integrated toolbox for the assessment of emotional functioning in dogs. And the second project, Consider My Nose, does a nose length affect social cognition in dogs. Today, she's going to talk about the perception and processing of human emotions in dogs and past and future directions of emotion research in animals in general. So Anjuli, the stage is yours, and we're very happy to have you here today.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear me? That would be interesting to know.
Yes, I think so. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. And you can also see the first slide?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, then let's start off. Thanks a lot, Christian, for the invitation and possibility to talk about my PhD research and about the things that I'm doing at the moment. I will give a short overview what I will talk about today. So it will be about face and emotion processing in dogs, and also physiological correlates of dogs' emotions, and a very, very brief overview of what I'm doing at the moment. So let's first start with the definition of emotion, because everybody has a slightly different definition of that. For me, an emotion is an intense, short-living, affective process as a response to a certain stimuli, and it's varying in valence and intensity. Also, an emotion is involving adaptive changes in behavioral, physiological, and neuronal processes. And when we ask what an emotion is good for, one thing would be if you're able to read emotions of others, you know when you have to run and when you can stay. So this is not only important for us, but also for every animal, every living animal, because it's increasing biological fitness. So why should we know more about animal emotions? So first of all, to facilitate human-animal bonds and to avoid human-animal incidents, but also to improve animal keeping and training. Another important question would be, why working with dogs? So first of all, they belong to one of the oldest domesticated animals. And today they have a really great social and economic value. So they are there to help us with our work, herding our livestock. They will sniff out illnesses. They will assist us when we have disabilities, and so on and so on. But also dogs are living in a really, really close relationship to a heterospecific, which makes them really, really interesting species. And it is known that dogs are excellent decoders of human behavior. So they're sensitive to our attentive status and ostensive cues. And anecdotally, everybody would say, well, obviously dogs will understand human emotions, but the question is, how do they do that? So what we know is that the face plays a really important role in the dog-human interaction. And if the face is covered, dogs will struggle to understand what we would like from them. And also they know if we are facing them or not. So normally a dog would not dare to steal something from the table when you're looking at it. And it's also known that, for example, during dog training, it is really important that they can see our eyes. So my study questions were how dogs perceive human faces and emotions and how they decode them, and what the influence of experience for that is. And in the second stage, also really important, it is to know, are dogs influenced by our emotions? And I've run some touchscreen and eye tracking studies and combined them with physiology, and yeah, I will talk about that now. So let's start with the questions, are dogs able to discriminate human emotions? This study was a touchscreen study, and we first started to train, or to do it pre-training, to see if dogs are at all able to discriminate a face from the back of a head. And all of the dogs that participated in the study were, so it's really good. At least they know what the face is and what a hair is. And then the dogs went to a training phase in which we showed the dogs just certain parts of the face. So some dogs had a training set of stimuli where we were only showing them the lower part of the face, and some dogs were seeing only the upper part of the face. And once they were able to discriminate between those, so the criteria was reaching 80% correct trials in 3 sessions, we interspersed some testing trials. And then we showed them some novel faces, but the same halves, some trained faces that they already had seen during the training, but the other half of the face. And most importantly, also the other half of the face, but from faces they had never seen before. As a control, we also showed them pictures of the left half of the face. These pictures, we were just showing them in the very, very last testing session, and I will not talk about that further. It was just a control. What we expected was that if dogs rely on local cues like the presence or absence of teeth or frown lines while smiling or making an angry face, that they wouldn't be able to solve the other half conditions. But if they would be able to discriminate emotional expressions, that they would be able to transfer the things that they had trained before to all of the probe trials. And indeed, all of the dogs were able to transfer this to also the other halves of the face, leaving us with the answer, yes, dogs can discriminate emotional expressions of human faces. Just some more additional information. It was not really important if the dogs were trained on the lower or the upper part of the face. So independent of that, they were always able to solve the task during the testing. But interestingly, the dogs that were trained on angry faces did a really, they had a really hard job. So it took them really long to went into the testing session, leaving us with the information that those faces are obviously perceived as threatening. So to sum that up, dogs can indeed discriminate emotional expressions of human faces, and this is definitely not only based on simple local cues, and angry faces are perceived as threatening. So dogs definitely use their memories of real human emotional expressions to solve the task. The next question I was asking then is, how do they process our faces? And what I was doing was some eye tracking studies, asking how our face is processed and what the effect of emotional expression is. and if this facial processing is also influenced by familiarity of the face. So again, a picture of the setup. We had a chin rest device where the dogs were trained to lay their snout on the chin rest. And then we were projecting stimuli onto the screen while we were tracking their eyes. The stimuli consisted of pictures of their owners and an unfamiliar person in 4 different emotional states, neutral and happy and angry and sad faces. And to get a further idea how experience would influence the face processing, I not only did the study with pet dogs, but also included some lab dogs into that. And don't let you freak out now when I say lab dogs. Those dogs are living on the campus at in Vienna, and they're having a quite good life. They're living there together in packs, and they're there for vet students to see a dog before they're going into the clinics. But most importantly, those dogs doesn't have experience with humans on a regular basis, so they differ quite a lot from our pet dogs. All right. After those eye tracking, we did later on an analysis of the fixation durations and fixation counts into different areas of interest, which were the forehead, the eye region, the mouth region, and the rest of the face. And also we had a look at the gaze directions. Okay. The expectation was that there would be definitely differences between positive and negative expressions, and that the dogs would need longer to process unfamiliar stimuli. And I expected differences between pet and lab dogs. Okay. So what you see here is the latency to fixate into a certain face region. So how long does it take a dog to fixate into that region? And what you can clearly see is that independent of dog groups or lab or pet dogs, that eye and mouth region was fixated much faster than the other regions. So dogs do look like humans also faster into more informative regions, which will be surely the eye and the mouth region. Expecting that lab dogs have less experience in processing human faces, I said beforehand that they would need to look at the faces longer, and this is indeed like that. So this is the mean fixation duration for pet dogs and lab dogs, split for positive and negative emotions. And surprisingly, there is not really a difference between positive and negative faces, but there's a difference between the lab and the pet dogs. So the lab dogs need much longer to process the faces. And also an interesting finding was that lab dogs do look less at the mouth region, while pet dogs fixate the mouth region fairly regularly, so more or less for every dog one time when we're showing this picture. Lab dogs are not really interested in those regions. And this might be solely an effect of training, because pet dogs are trained to listen to us. They are getting commands from us on an everyday basis. So they know that the mouth region might be a really important region, while the lab dogs don't. I think the most amazing finding was something that has to do with face recognition. And if everybody would look at this blue cross in the middle, and this is more or less like a self-test, I will show you a picture of a face and ask you a question afterwards. So let's go 3, 2, 1. All right. So which eye color does this woman have? And most of you will likely answer she has brown eyes. But indeed, she has some heterochromia. So she has 2 different eye colors. that most of us would answer brown eyes is something that has to do with brain laterality, because the right brain is responsible for emotion and face recognition. And that is why we tend to have a left gaze bias when we are looking at faces and emotional expressions. And this is not only for us, but also for the dogs. So if you have a look at the first fixation that the dogs are doing into the face region, then this is clearly directed to the left side, and therefore hint for emotion processing. Some voices would say, well, it might be face processing, but I have done some more research and I don't want to spoiler, but I'm pretty sure it's emotion processing. If there is a bit more time later on, I can maybe show you a slide where I back up this, or you just go back to my publications possibly. But for now, this is the conclusion of this experiment. So the processing of human faces by dogs is influenced just weakly by familiarity and emotional expressions, but really strongly by the amount of exposure and or the human-dog relationship. And there is a clear evidence for emotion processing when we are looking at lateralization while they're looking at faces. The last thing we have to ask then, how are dogs experiencing human emotions? And what I have done is that while doing this eye tracking experiment, we were also taking the heart rate of the dogs. So they were seeing the same stimuli, so owner and unfamiliar faces and 4 different emotional states. And we were doing that with the pet and the lap dogs. And considering that processing is only is strongly influenced by the experiencing of the dog, we would expect that the pet dogs react differently than the lap dogs. So I expected that the lap dogs would be much more aroused than the pet dogs would be. Given that the processing is only weakly influenced by emotion and familiarity, when they're looking at the faces, I didn't expect it too much from the heart rate data. But given that the dogs are processing the emotions somehow, I was really curious to see what happens. And what I expected is that the heart rate will be higher for high arousal emotional expressions like angry and happy faces. I didn't have a really big clue or idea for sad faces, and I expected them to be not really aroused when they're seeing neutral faces. Okay, so let's start off with the mean heart rate of the pet dogs for familiar in green and unfamiliar in red. And there's not really an effect of familiarity. And this might be because they have plenty of experience with a variety of faces. But when looking at into the lap dogs, the familiar faces were much more arousing for them. And because these experiments needed some training beforehand, they had quite some positive experience with this familiar person. So this might be why they're more aroused when seeing faces of this person. So maybe they're expecting a positive outcome. Just to explain why the lap dogs are much lower in general than the pet dogs, this is due to the fact that the pet dogs was a cohort of really diverse breeds. So it was big dogs and small dogs, but the lap dogs were all beagles. So this is why there is such difference between that. Okay, so when looking into the heart rate for the different emotional expressions, the pet dogs more or less reacted in the way that I expected it. So they had a really high arousal for angry faces, a bit lower arousal for happy faces, a quite high arousal for neutral faces, which was surprising, and we'll come to that in a second, and a low arousal for sad face. I will talk about that later on as well. So coming back to the high arousal in the neutral faces, this might be due to the fact that neutral faces are normally never perceived as neutral. So there are some publications saying that a neutral phase is normally perceived slightly negatively, because people, when they're looking neutral, look a bit sad or a bit angry. So this might be the reason why the neutral expression is causing such a high arousal in the pet dogs as well. Okay, so now remember what I said beforehand, that lab dogs, due to less experience, would have a higher arousal than the pet dogs. They were strange. They did something totally weird and totally unexpected. And they reacted completely the other way around than the pet dogs. So they had a really, really low arousal for the angry faces and a quite high arousal for the sad faces. And I was quite puzzled for a really long time why it is that way. But given the fact that they're differing a lot in experience, it can be that the pet dogs have a much faster reaction when seeing such faces. And so let's just talk only about the angry faces now. So for example, they would then prepare for a fight and flight response. But lab dogs, they don't really have the experience, so they're much slower in the reaction. They have to process much longer, and they don't really know what's happening. So they're going into a state of increased attention and freezing and tonic immobility. And this comes along with a lowered heart rate. If somebody would have a better explanation than that, I would be happy to talk about that, but this is certainly something I would explain this. All right, I wanted to say something about the sad faces. So a sad face might be a bit ambiguous. So it might be that the dogs never had really a lot of experience with those faces. So that might be causing this low arousal for the pet dogs and the really high arousal for the lab dogs, because they just don't know what it is. Okay. So summing up, so dogs react upon our emotional expressions, and this is strongly linked to their experience. So the social environment of a dog plays an important role regarding their physiological correlates when confronted with emotional stimuli. And yeah, knowing all of that, I was asking myself, oh no, let's go first like that. The take-home message. Dogs can discriminate emotional expressions of human faces. They're able to process the semantic content of facial expressions, and experience affects how they perceive and process those expressions. And most importantly, they are also influenced by our emotions. So we have to be careful how we're treating our dogs. Right. As I started already before, knowing all of that, I was asking myself where to go from there. And I think the next step is then, how can we measure emotions in dogs? So dogs are also highly expressive animals. So they have facial expressions, they have bodily expressions, but by just looking at them, normally you would never be able to tell apart what the facial expressions, for example, would say. I have really long-standing experience in dog research, dog handling, dog training. And for example, me would never say for the third picture, this is an angry dog, or for the second last, oh, that looks surprised. So it would be really nice to have a toolbox to measure this. And this is what I'm doing right now. So I'm working on a toolbox to measure emotions in animals, which is not only measuring arousal, but also the valence, so that we can tear apart, is this animal now happy? Is it sad? Is it somehow angry? And so on and so on. And I think one of the biggest challenges for that, and I'm working on that really at the moment, is the temporal dependency of those measures. So which fits together best, and what is the best combination for this toolbox? And then later on to generalize this not only for one individual over several contexts, but also then to generalize this to other species. Because the main idea is not only having that for domesticated animals, but also for livestock and zoo animals and laboratory animals. So this is the long-term goal of having this toolbox. Because if we are able to measure the emotion of the animals, we could respond to every animal individual and reduce the stress for animals. And from there, we can go and improve selection, improve the training methods, improve breeding, animal keeping, and experimental conditions for both animals and scientists. It would be nice if I could show you much more on the ITME, but at the moment, obviously, due to the COVID lockdown, all the research has stopped. And so you have to stay tuned, and maybe I can give another talk somewhere in some month and show you some of the results for that. Okay, so I have to thank a lot of universities, a lot of funders, and also people that are providing me with dog food to do my research.